The next thing I'm up to with putting this back together is building up the left-hand side, but there's a few things I'll ramble about while I'm doing this. So the first thing I'm going to do is put the key in the timing shaft, and once the key is in the timing shaft, we can put the timing gears on. And there's a couple of things I'm going to talk about with the timing gears. Pull the keyway into the shaft. This bike, being a 659 monster, which is a 696 monster with a shorter stroke for Australia and New Zealand, it ran a Siemens Conti M3C ECU. And on the timing gear, because the pickup on these engines is up here, just like a 1098 and all the later things that came, the Siemens Conti ECU uses two cutouts in the timing gear. And the way they run the fuel injection, when the engine's turning, the rotation sensor up here sees the cutout in the gear and then the cutout in this side as well, which are 180 degrees apart. And it uses the acceleration and deacceleration of the gear to work out where in a cycle it is. So it's basically exactly the same as using a crank sensor. But the reason they would have done this is because everything else had the sensor here, so they weren't going to introduce a whole new machining setup and sensor location just to satisfy this engine, so they did this. The idea of sensing the crank rotation or the timing gear rotation and working out the acceleration and deacceleration to work out where top dead center firing is for each cylinder is something that we first came across in the F650 GS BMWs. They were a single pickup engine. And then the Aprilia SXV and RXV 450s and 550s use the same system. And on them in particular, you can hear when they start up as a wasted spark and wasted fuel engine. And then it takes a few rotations and then it goes to sequential. So it works out where it is, but you can hear the engine note change. Whereas I've never really noticed it happening with these, but obviously it has to do that because it can't, from the very start, know where it is. So because this engine I'm going to run first as carbs with an Ignitec, you can use an Ignitec to run off this system with the original pickup in here. But this engine may be fuel injected at some point. So what I decided to do was replace this gear with this gear. This gear is from a Marelli ECU model, 59M, 5AM, with the rotation sensor up here. So it's from a 1098, 1198, 848, Hypermotard 1100. And the reason I got this gear is so if I want to run this engine fuel injected, I'll either run it with probably a 1.5M ECU from Supersport or Monster injected, 1998 to 2002, because I like those ECUs, they're nice and simple. I could possibly run it with a 5.9 or a 5AM, but it's possibly a bit easier to use a 1.6M. Anyway, so for that ECU you need one cutout on the timing gear, which is there. But the other Marelli timing gear is this one. And if we align the keyways pointing towards the camera, this one has the cutout here, whereas this earlier gear, which is from an S4 Monster, has it over here. And that's because on the S4 Monster and all the previous models had the rotation sensor in the alternator cover, sort of about here. So the cutout, which there is a much smaller cutout than the cutout on this gear, the cutout's in a different place. And that's just simply to do with the location of the sensor. So if you decide you were going to put a alternator cover, which you can't on this engine because the bolt pattern's changed. But if you wanted to put an early alternator cover on a later engine with the sensor here, you need to change the gear. Or you need to get into the ECU software and change the sequencing, because it's simply a mathematical angle, but you need to know exactly where it is. So that's sort of the difference. It's there versus there. And if we put them on, I'll put the timing gear on the crank. Keyway's just there. There's 2 dots on the timing gear, and on the timing shaft gear, sorry, there's 2 dots on the crank gear. On the timing shaft gear, there is 1 dot, and that dot sits between those 2. Yep. So, like so. So this should be top dead center horizontal firing. So the cutout is here, which means that when the cutout is over here, it will be top dead center overlap. And that's when the cutout will be at the sensor. Whereas with this gear, when we put this gear in, find the, oops, 1 tooth off. Now she's taking off. It's there, and the cutout is over here, which I would assume means that the sensor is sort of here. And so once again, it's 180 degrees, or because this is top dead center horizontal firing, that will come around a top dead center horizontal overlap, and that's when the cutout will line up with the sensor. Let's try and get this off again now. Yeah. Oh. There we go, you just got to wait for the shaft to fall out. Now, put our gear, it's the right spot for the gear. Where's the keyway? Out there, there we go. So there's 1 dot here on the timing gear, 2 dots here on the crank gear, so that's where it needs to go. Now, one thing I'm going to do now that I wouldn't do on a customer engine is I'm going to reuse the lock tab, because I can't be bothered putting a new one in. But I don't ever do that on customer engines. And the reason why I don't do it on customer engines is because I just don't. I like to put new ones on. I usually put a mark on a lock tab and then onto the gear at where the tab is, just so when I tighten it up, I'm sure that it hasn't moved. Yep, and off goes the shaft again. It's quite annoying, this shaft, I must say. Now I've lost where the, there we go. Okay, let's put the nut on and stop the mess. Okay, so that goes in there. To tighten this up, I usually lock the gear just with a 6mm hex key in one of the case bolts and 45 Newton meters. Like that. With the line on the lock washer and the gear, you can see it hasn't moved, so I just need to bend the lock washer over. I'll bend it in a different place to where it was bent last time. And that's our timing gear on. Next I'm going to put, what's next? Next, I need to put the idler gear for the starter circuit on. This is the idler gear for the starter drive. Now usually these have a shim washer underneath and then one on top, but this one doesn't have enough room to have one on both sides, which is quite odd. Oops. Just realised before I put this on, I need to put the starter motor in, because once that gear's on, I can't get to this starter motor hole. So next is the starter motor. So this is our starter motor. I possibly should have painted it, but I'm not going to bother because I'm just going to put it in. This one's done about 30,000 Ks apparently, so I'm not going to bother putting a set of brushes in it, but if it was a high kilometre starter, I'd certainly pull the end cap off, check the brushes out, and possibly put a set of brushes in it. New gasket, these are the rubberized steel shim gaskets. Some people would just coat this in goop and stick it in. That kind of makes my skin crawl. So I'm going to use a new gasket. The screws for the starter motor, you can see the red stuff. That's what they call encapsulated Loctite. So you can't really lubricate these threads because they've already got a thread locker of sort on them. There's two internal and one external. The gasket only goes one way, so you just got to make sure you get it in the right spot. Yeah. And 10 Newton meters. As ever. Okay. Starter motor in. Now back to our gear. As I said, they usually have one of these shim washers underneath and one on top as well, but this one, there's no room for one on top. We want to get the circlip in, so it's just like that. Which realistically probably isn't a big deal. I mean, these don't spin very often or very fast. Put the circlips in. A bit more oil. And there we go. You can see there's a starter motor bolt there and a starter motor bolt down here, which you can't get to with the idler gear on. The next thing that goes on is the flywheel assembly. The one on mine, this is mine, the flywheel piece on these is this bit here, and this piece in the middle with the splines, that's part of that. This piece is just a bolt-in ring that the starter clutch drives, and on this side we have the alternator magnet, which is a big cup or basket you might call it. This flywheel's been machined down. Originally it looks like that, and a couple of things with the original like this is it has a hole here and a hole here, and those holes are for the holding tools, and you plonk that on, and there's a tool that bolts to the side stand bolts, and it comes out a big sort of C-shaped tool with a bracket on it, and it has two screws that bolt into those holes, and that locates the flywheel. When you machine it down like I have, you don't have those holes anymore, so you can't locate the flywheel that way. What I use is the tool that we originally had to pull the three-phase alternators out, which we would have got in 1998 sometime at Moto 1. It's this tool, and these grooves here locate on the heads of the bolts, which is great, except that these ones are a little hex head, and usually they're a cap head. So I'm not sure how well it's going to locate on this, but that's the tool I have, so that's the tool I will use. As for lightening the flywheels, a lot of people don't like light flywheels, or they claim all sorts of stuff's going to happen. I would not run one of these with a standard weight flywheel personally. I don't see the point. There's not really that much difference, but it just makes them spin up a bit nicer. They're a bit easier to adjust the revs for engine braking. They're less likely to lock the back wheel up. But the difference isn't that much. With the flywheel machined like that, it's about 1 kilo lighter than this. But this assembly, like this, is still 2.6 kilos. The crank itself is about 6.5 to 7 kilos on these. And you've got the rods, which are sort of 500 grams each. So you've got at least, probably 2/3 of the rod weight equivalently spinning around. So if you say there's maybe 8 or 9 kilos spinning around, taking a kilo off isn't a huge reduction. And it really doesn't make that much difference in my experience. My usual comment for lightweight flywheels is that lightweight flywheels exaggerate poor low-speed tuning. If the engine stalls at idle, it probably needs more ignition advance at idle than anything else. And it really shouldn't make that much difference. And it's just one of the things I would always do. Before I fit these, I like to just wipe all the oil off the inside here, where the central bearing runner is going to sit. The starter drive gear goes into the back of the starter clutch. And if you just rotate it, usually it'll just sort of slide in nicely. There we go. And it rotates. So if you have it sitting that way, it should drive it clockwise. That's free spins that way. This is the bearing runner that sits inside, that goes over the crank. The needle roller bearing in here, which is what this gear spins on, because this gear, when the engine's running, this gear just sits stationary and everything in the middle rotates. And the only thing to be really aware of is this thrust washer. Now, they've always had this thrust washer in all the belt drive engines. In the single phase alternator belt drive engines, you can see there's a snout here on this central bush. Well, on the single phase engines, that snout was only thick enough for the washer. And the gear, which you can see here, has got a groove in it in the middle. And that groove takes the end of this, like that. So when you put it together, this thrust washer is located. But on the single phase alternator bikes, there wasn't a groove in the crank gear. So when this bearing runner went down, it just went flat against the gear, and this washer could get caught between the gear and the bearing runner, like so, and stick out the side. And you could torque it all down and people would put it together like that. If you torque them down with that thrust washer jammed between the end of the runner and the crank gear, it'll bend the end of the crank. And you can see it if you, what I would sometimes do is if the engine's in the bike, you're just doing this as a starter clutch replacement job, just hit the start button. With all the bits off, it's not going to start. But hit the start button and you'll see the end of the crank, if that washer is in the wrong spot, the end of the crank will just spin out of round. It's quite amazing how much difference it can make. So you really need to be aware of where this thrust washer is. On these 3-phase alternator engines, it's not so much of an issue because it really can't be in the wrong spot unless you really make a mistake. But on single-phase alternator engines, you really need to be aware of it because you can get it wrong very easily. On these ones, you can just drop that in, put the bearing on, seal runner in, and the seal runner falls into the gear. And that thrust washer is located and can't go anywhere. Just wipe the oil off the end of it. We drop the flywheel and the starter drive gear on. Now on the crank, there's two slots here, which is what we put our crank turning tool in, but one of the slots on a 3-phase alternator engine is extended down there. And that's like the master slot, if you like. If you look at this flywheel center, there's a dot there. You line that dot up with that slot. Now the reality is that it's actually meaningless on one of these because there isn't anything on the flywheel that does anything at all. If it's a carburetted bike from 1998 to 2001, then there will be ignition pickups, lumps on the flywheel that need to correspond to the pickups. So you need to make sure that it goes in the right spot. On the 999, 749 series engines or the Testastretta engines, there's also a drilling in here where oil squirts out to keep the alternator cool. I'm not really sure why they decided to do that only on the Testastrettas, but it is only on Testastrettas. One other thing to be aware of, there's a lip on the back of this magnet here, and often down this back edge it will collect sludge because it's like a big sludge trap, like the end of the cranks often have. The centrifuge just throws crap out and it gets caught in here. So sometimes you'll think, okay, I'll just get a rag, a bit of brake cleaner and wipe my finger around it and get rid of the sludge. That edge there is just razor sharp and it will just cut through your finger with absolute joy. So if you decide to clean that up, be really aware of the fact that you don't want to put your finger anywhere near that because it just cuts. You don't even feel it cutting it. And then you go, oh, why's all the blood? So we pop this on, down onto splines, and now it's located in the right spot. The thrust washer can't be in the wrong place. And just a quick check that everything that had to go in before that is in. I'm pretty sure it is. This is why the gear selector has to go in first. If you want to change your springs, you have to pull everything out. I'm going to do something else now that I wouldn't normally do on a customer engine, and that is reuse this crank nut. This nut has always been spec'd as a single-use nut. I know a lot of people Loctite them back on and reuse them. I generally don't, just because the manual says not to, and I don't need the aggro that comes with that if it goes wrong. The torque spec on this nut, originally when these were first released, the 3-phase alternators in 1998, 99, was 180 Newton meters, which was the same as the previous models, the single-phase alternator nut. And then they had issues with these nuts coming loose, and people blamed the fit of the nut and all that sort of stuff, but realistically, whatever it was, if you didn't Loctite them on, they came loose. And I even saw a couple of them Loctited on at 180 that did come loose, I think. I think I did one on a bike that then came loose fairly soon thereafter. And at 180, people would put lightweight aluminium flywheels in, which when you get an aluminium flywheel, it's the complete assembly, it's the big bit, and it's this center bit here. And the aluminium splines would tear out if the flywheel nut wasn't done up really tight. So the torque spec increased from 180 to 270. And on some models, it even went up to like 330. I think some of the late ST3 manuals will have 330 in it. Maybe some other models. I don't really get too involved in models past 2010, like multi-12s and that sort of stuff, but I'm pretty sure they were really tight as well. So you always Loctite this nut on. If it's a new nut, or I'm reusing one now, Loctite and Worth green, or if you can get Loctite green, or at least Loctite red 262. Now there's a washer that goes on between the flywheel and the nut, and it always used to be like a conical washer or a big spring washer. It would just flatten out as you tighten the nut down. And I've never seen a flat one there. This one's flat. But this being a 2013 engine, they seem to change a lot of things for 2013. So possibly it was just a revision. And realistically, the big conical thing, which would have been an anti-rattle-proof sort of thing, given that it's up to 270 Newton meters, I can't see that really solving a nut coming loose problem. What I like to do is put a little bit of oil just on the face of this, so when the nut hits it, it doesn't gall on it or drag on it, but you don't want any of the oil getting into the thread. So you're just sort of putting just a tiny amount at the outer edge. Probably more than I would like. Just a tiny bit. Just so when it hits it, there's some lubrication on the sliding faces. And now we go the Loctite. And I tend to just coat the nut and the crank. Actually start on the wrong side of the nut. Coat the nut and the crank with Loctite. Because these nuts really did come loose quite alarmingly early on. It was really annoying. And you could sort of tell when they were loose, because on the dry clutch engines, you'd pull the clutch in and the glunk, 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 glunk noise that the clutch makes, which when you pull the lever in, usually becomes a ding, 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 rattle sort of thing, it wouldn't change. It would just keep going glunk, 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 glunk. And that meant this nut was loose. And also we saw a few push rods, the clutch push rod that goes across to this hole here, they've got two O-rings. The push rod would break at one of the O-ring grooves. And if that push rod's broken at an O-ring groove, it meant the flywheel nut was loose. So things to be aware of. And these, once they came loose, these would start rocking around and start chewing into things, and they'd start chewing the inside of the alternator cover, and they used to make some real mess of things. Okay, so we've got a heap of Loctite on the nut and the crank. This is a 30mm nut. Got to get it down. It's already starting to tighten up a bit. This is my locking tool, which hopefully will be fine on those bolt heads. And we're going for 270 Newton meters, which I've really got to hold the tool in. I've got an old fork leg on the end of it. Should have got the ratchet. There we go, it's on. And then we just pull. Ah, Jesus. Ah, goodness. Sometimes 270 seems much tighter than you expect. Okay, so that's 270 Newton meters, and the crank nut is tight. And just make sure it turns nicely. Turns nicely that way, and that way it will drive the starter motor circuit. You see the starter motor, idler gears, and the starter motor's turning. That's the direction of engine rotation, counterclockwise from the left. And that spins really nicely.